MAID, or medical assistance in dying, is back in the spotlight with a new case involving a woman with autism seeking MAID and her father who has objected to the courts. And while many can understand the desire for those who are terminally ill to end their life on their own terms through MAID, much of the debate now is on the expansion of MAID to include criteria beyond those who are terminally ill. Some of those debates include those with mental illness, those who are suffering homelessness, and a wide variety of other justifications. Joining us now to discuss the debate over MAID is Meagan Gillmore, reporter at Canadian Affairs. Meagan, thanks for joining us again on Forum Daily.
Thanks for having me.
So to start here, the case that I mentioned involves a woman with autism. Where does that case stand right now?
Sure. So the case in question is WV versus MV. It's out of Alberta. And right now it is being appealed to the Alberta Court of Appeal. So there will be an appeal. It's being scheduled right now. We don't know exactly when it will be heard, but the case is being appealed.
And this case highlights some core questions that really need to be answered regarding who can and who cannot access MAID. Are there any limits right now in terms of cognitive ability or functioning to determine if someone is capable of making that decision for themselves?
Sure. So I'm going to answer that question in two parts. And the first part is to address the specific question about cognitive functioning. And the second part is to briefly outline some of the other criteria in the criminal code. So in terms of cognitive functioning, the criminal code says that an individual must be deemed capable. So it's a capacity assessment similar to capacity assessments that doctors do all the time for a medical procedure. But the criminal code also lists other criteria. And one of them has to do with suffering. So an individual who is applying for MAID to be deemed eligible, they need to have what the law calls a grievous and irremediable condition, which is an incurable illness, disease, or disability that is causing them, or they're experiencing prolonged physical or psychological suffering that, in their opinion, cannot be alleviated by a means that they think is acceptable. So there's two things there. The suffering is actually determined by the individual, not by a medical practitioner. And then the decision about, is this means to alleviate my suffering going to be used, is also up to the individual. It's a means that they decide is not acceptable to them. So in the case of somebody who has a terminal illness, there could potentially be treatments for that. But if they decide, hey, I don't want to do it, then they don't have to do it. Those are like the broad strokes, which would have, yeah.
And what are the, when someone seeks out MAID, what are the reporting requirements for physicians after a MAID death?
Sure. So there are federal requirements that physicians fill out a form that lists the eligibility criteria in the criminal code, and they would say whether or not that was met, and they're obviously going to say that it was. Like, these are self-reporting by physicians, so they're required to do that. And there's been increased regulations that were passed last year that are asked questions about an individual's race, cultural background, questions about if they have a disability, what type of disability, that patients can include that information as well. So that's new. An important thing to note about this is that this reporting information, which we use in Canada to form the basis of our federal annual reports on MAID, this is all self-reported by physicians. So there isn't necessarily an independent review process of these forms to ensure that they were filled up with.
What are some of the major concerns about that self-reporting?
One of the major concerns that bioethicists will raise is if somebody was approved for MAID in a way that contradicts the criminal code, a physician is it's not likely that they're going to self-report, hey, I broke the criminal code of Canada, right? Like, people wouldn't you just wouldn't do that. Like, why would you say that? So that's a big concern. There's also concerns about the fact that, unlike other countries, Canada does not have a review body, like an independent review body that then comes in and looks through the information and says, hey, was this done appropriately or not? The Netherlands, for example, does. But we don't.
Yeah.
So some provinces and territories will have their own little review bodies, but there's nothing standard across the country.
Meagan, thank you very much for your time today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.